Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello. As European leaders gather today for yet another slithering, crisis-grappling summit, all too aware of the anger on the streets of Athens, and as we hear of more bloody confrontation in Syria, we're looking at the subject of uprising, or revolution. Paul Mason, economics editor of BBC's Newsnights, argues in Why It's Kicking Off Everywhere that apparently disparate protest movements from the Arab world to Europe are connected by the failure of the latest version of capitalism and by the techniques protesters use. Mary King, a peace studies professor at Oxford, is sceptical about too much emphasis being placed on the internet. She's been studying the peaceful overthrow of regimes around the world. And exactly a year after those extraordinary scenes in Cairo's Tahrir Square, we start with one of the bloggers who helped to orchestrate that uprising, who was arrested and held blindfolded for 11 days, but who is with us this morning. Wael, Ghonim, welcome. Let's start by describing your position at the beginning of the unrest. You were unusual in the sense that you were actually not in Egypt itself, and you were working for Google.
Yes. Actually, at the beginning, I'd like to thank you for hosting me, and I want to say that I don't want to take much credit of orchestrating the uprising. I think that this is something. The revolution was leaderless, and it was ignited by many people who have worked together, and it has to be fair. To be fair,
you have to be fair to others.
Everyone.
But and your book about this is, you're very careful not to take too much credit. Nonetheless, your website was one of the places where people gathered and which disseminated information about the protests as they started.
Yep.
Tell us a little bit about what the website did, how you started it, the original photograph that began it all.
It started on the 8th of June. I saw a photo on Facebook on my wall of a young Egyptian who looked, horribly tortured. The picture was just horrible. I looked at it, and it turned out that his name is Khalid Saeed. He died after two security police officers were chasing him, and according to witnesses, he was beaten up to death. At that time, I started, few months before, I started to become politically active. I was not happy with how my country was going, and I thought that it was important to do something. I leveraged my knowledge, so I created a page, and that page was on Facebook that say, "We are all Khalid Saeed." I wanted to defend his right, and I wanted to make sure that justice will prevail in his case and many other cases. And what was very interesting at that stage was that because he came from a middle class, he was an internet user, a lot of people connected with him, and that was very critical in the whole story.
So this allowed, as it were, a conversation to take place, which could not have taken place physically on the streets or in cafes at that time.
Absolutely. And this is what I explain in the book. A lot of people started to express themselves in the virtual world because they were scared in the actual world. But not only that, the fact that you can communicate, you can do a lot of many-to-many communications online, makes you more interested in going through your goals. So, for example, when I created the page, in the first day, there was 36,000 people on the page. A lot of them wrote comments and participated and said something about it. If you come and join that crowd of 36,000 people, you'll be more encouraged to participate than if you find out that only 5 people discussing something.
So numbers count. One of the other things that you explain in the book is the way that you describe yourself on the page. You say I, you talk about in your own name, and you use Demotic Egyptian, not classical Arabic, and you're careful not to be too aggressive in the language you use. You were taking quite conscious decisions about the tone of the page.
Yeah, I believe that it was a bliss that I was never an activist. Actually, I was never a blogger before that. Why was it a bliss? Because I think that in a lot of cases, activists start, unintentionally, there would be a gap between them and others, because they see, for example, those human rights activists in countries like Egypt who experience the torture and, meet with the cases, the victims, somehow become disconnected from the masses because they see things others don't see and they don't connect with. I was very keen, intentionally as well as unintentionally, to make sure that I am part of the mainstream. I'm someone who would speak as I, not we. Mm-hmm. This is not an organization. The page is not like 50 people sitting behind the scenes and planning things.
So there are a lot of people involved, but there's an intimacy, there's a directness, eyeball to eyeball, as it were.
Yeah, and there is lack of conspiracies. People feel that this person speaks on my behalf. He's saying, I remember just 10 or 12 days after creating the page, I started to get questions like, who are you? Because a lot of people called me the admin on the page. Mm-hmm. So a lot of posts were like, you have to disclose who are you. So I wrote a note, who are you, Mr. Admin? And I basically described myself. I said that I'm someone who was, since I was born, Mubarak was the president of Egypt. I'm someone who is just like you, unhappy with what happens in this country. So why aren't you telling us who are your identity? It's because number one, I'm scared that if I if I disclose my identity, I will be arrested, or because I don't want to take credit for it.
Let's just move on from the moment to the moment when the protests start to take place in the real world, in the physical world, and the silent stands that you were part of as well. Just remind us how what those were and how they happened.
The biggest debate at that time was internet. Would the virtual world become active in the real world? That was the biggest debate that was going on at the time. One of the members of the page, and that was one of the best things in the page, that we've been collaboratively working together. One of the members suggested that we do silent stands. The regime is against protests. They arrest protesters. How about we all dress in black, go to the street, stand up for 1 hour wearing black? And we do like human body chains. You cannot really arrest someone because he's wearing black and standing up in the street not doing anything. And that started in June, 18th of June, and we did it like 5 times. Sometimes there were like 3 or 4 kilometers of people wearing black and standing up, giving their backs to the street, and that was the strongest message, that we're unhappy, but we're not going to do anything about it. And by then, I think the conversion started of taking people from the page to the street.
Yes, and as that grows, eventually you are arrested yourself. You're picked up and you're bundled into a police van, blindfolded, and you're kept in terrifying circumstances for 11 days or so. But you're not actually tortured and you're not killed. And already there is something ambivalent in the regime's attitude to you, wasn't there?
Yeah, nothing other than the psychological torture. It was
which was extreme enough, I'm sure.
Yeah, the biggest problem, I think, and how it impacted me was that I did not know when I'm going to be out. It could be days, it could be years, and you're not communicating with the world and you can't see anything. That was the hardest part. But when I went out, the regime thought I can be the leader of this movement, and then they can put pressure on me. And I made it very clear that this is not going to happen. Not just because I saw it, it's also because I believed I shouldn't be taking too much credit or becoming a leader for something I haven't really done.
Paul Mason, to explain to us how every experience is special and every revolutionary uprising or revolt is different, but whether there are common strands in the story that we've just heard that we'll find in other places around the world.
I mean, absolutely. I think Ghonim's book is a worked example of an individual story that you find again and again in the last 2 or 3 years. First of all, a lot of the decisions and the inflection points of the movement are able to be taken online in a relatively democratic way. I mean, there's a discussion in the We Are Khalid Said page about where the movement's going. Meanwhile, the real world movement has to huddle in cafes and is terrified of the secret police. The other interesting thing you say is about what traditionally we've called vanguards. That is, the activists are detaching themselves. Their language is different. They live this hunted lifestyle. Right now, I think that those kind of hierarchical, smaller vanguard groups, whether they are Islamists, whether they're leftists, they're having to renegotiate their relationship with ordinary people.
People won't be led in the way that they once would have been.
Absolutely. And the other thing, of course, is you come out of prison. You are interviewed in this traumatic interview live on Egyptian TV. And to people like me, journalists watching throughout the world, the very interesting thing then is the way the Egyptian Twitter sphere and blogosphere erupts in response to the way you are questioned and the pressure that's then put on you, because the story doesn't stop when you come out of jail. The regime is pushing you. And they almost self-destruct in their attempt to get him to act like a traditional hierarchical mediator.
Is that what you felt was going on when you were being interviewed at that moment? There was a sort of... There was a toppling moment. No,
I didn't see it like that. But eventually, right after Mubarak stepped down, because of what happened to me, which I explained in the book, one day before he stepped down, I started to look at it from a different perspective. I was, they hoped that they can have a voice, that had an impact on people, that tell people go back home, and it's enough. We've achieved a lot.
Mary King, there is a danger in becoming so entranced and obsessed by the latest technology, in this case, for instance, Twitter and Facebook, that we almost begin to think these uprisings can't happen without the latest technology. But your experience is that there is always a new technology which is always going to be employed by people who are engaged in mass peaceful protest.
That's absolutely right. Communications is phenomenally important with nonviolent movements, and particularly national nonviolent movements, because people need to understand that they're going to be fighting without violence. That requires argumentation, explanation, teaching. People need to look at old grievances in new ways. So communications are really important, because in order for people to believe that they can make a difference, they have to start thinking in a different way. And in order to think, you're using the force of ideas rather than military force. In order to begin to provoke thinking, potentiation, lots and lots of small groups beginning to realize that they can play a part. All of that requires communications. And what mass nonviolent movements do is to appropriate the latest technology, whatever it is. So African Americans traveled by steamship to India to learn about what had gone on in the Gandhian struggles on the Indian subcontinent. Today it's possible for a Google executive to do what you've done, Wael. We may, if we get together 10 years from now, we may be talking about other technologies that we haven't even dreamt of. And again, it will be the nonviolent movements that have appropriated them.
I want to come on to why the Mubarak regime fell and why it was successful, that particular revolution, in a moment. But before we do, well, just give us your perspective on where Egypt is now, because a year on, we've had elections, parties are forming and so on, but the process of toppling a dictator is not the same as the process of creating a fully formed democratic system, is it?
Yeah. Just one comment. I can't agree more with what Mary said, because this is very important. We're trying to give too much credit to social media, and I think it's understood. Everyone wants, because this is like a nice story. It's the new thing. Yeah. In Egypt, 2010, a lot of strikes happened and protests. Internet helped organize that, and as Mary said, any technology at the time, phones did help as well. Mobile devices did help big time during the revolution. Going back to Egypt, personally, the way I see it is that I'm very optimistic. I think we have achieved things during the past 12 months that if someone have told me this is going to happen 2 years ago, I would say this guy is crazy. We have toppled Mubarak and his team. Most of them are in prison at the moment for the first time in Egypt history, in the last 60 years. And this is the most critical part. Over 27 million Egyptians took to the street to vote in a democratically organized elections. This have never happened. Yet, there are many challenges ahead of us. The biggest one at the moment, or the most critical one, is doing the complete transition of power to a president and a parliament. Right after we elect a president, then we're probably done with the process. But then here comes the revolution demands, why people took to the streets.
It's about economics, about pay, about rights, about the
Yes.
conditions in the slums around Cairo.
There are a lot of areas that we have. This country was managed by a one-man show for many years. It's going to take time. We're recovering from 60 years of military rule, 30 years of dictatorship. I personally believe that patience is very critical, and being optimistic is very critical, because you cannot really change things if you are, if you think we're doomed. We have to work out. We have to work
ways
out
of not being doomed. Let's move on, if we could, to why these things happened when they did. Paul Mason, in your book, Why It's Kicking Off Everywhere, perhaps the most startling claim is that what's been happening on the streets of Athens, even what's been happening in this country, where you've got student demonstrations, is in some respect connected to what's been going on in the Arab world. Now, for most people, this seems an impossibly large leap, but explain to us in economic terms why you think there is a direct connection.
Well, the first thing to say is that it doesn't seem impossibly large to the participants. A lot of them know each other. They know each other online. They communicate with each other. Some of the people involved in the student protests turned up on the Day of the Camels inside Tahrir Square. I'm talking about English students. So it's not so far-fetched to them. The Occupy movement, I think it was about 800 cities across the world. I mean, that's across the world, including the third world. I mean, it wasn't such a startling idea to them that the problem is in some way connected. And the problem is, I think people have kind of given up and had enough of a world run by rich people for rich people. That's what connects Egypt and Tunisia to Greece and Wall Street. The technology of it, of course, the role of technology changes, but the economics, well, it depends where you are. I think in Southern Europe we're seeing a reaction to the bankrupting of states. I think in the North African situation, I don't claim that the economics were primary, in the sense that this is a dictatorship that's on its last legs. It's about to hand over
classic father-to-son
dictatorship, and people just like Ghonim, who are professionals who can see the dysfunctionality of this for the modern world, have just had enough of it. But there's a specific economic detonator in terms of
this is what I wanted to get
food
to,
prices.
Yeah.
I mean, the quantitative easing policy of the Americans was to create a wall of money which fired up inflation in the developing world, so that they could help save the American economy. And it was so
the Fed is printing huge quantities of money,
and this creates, and not just this, but I think we're in a world where every economic recovery at the moment prompts commodity price inflation and asset price inflation. It's an unstable world. In that year of asset price inflation, a whole bunch of people, about 1 billion people, were pushed from $2 a day poverty to $1 a day poverty, its equivalent, by inflation. Now, as I say, this is not the primary detonator of the Egyptian revolution. But when I interviewed some of the Egyptian revolutionaries who went to some of the suburbs on the 25th of January, they said to me, look, what we learned is to stop shouting down, down Hosni Mubarak, and instead to shout how expensive is sugar, how expensive is bread, why do we have to sell our furniture? And that is what brought how 200 people bring 20,000 slum dwellers into Tahrir.
And indeed, one of the banks mapped the rise in food prices against what had happened in 1848, when there was a wave
Absolutely.
of revolution around Europe.
I'm an economics journalist, and one of the most interesting things every morning is what comes into your email inbox. And between the fall of Ben Ali in Tunisia and Mubarak, economists at Barings had decided to map the famous study of bread prices in 1848 against what they could find for wheat prices and bread prices in North Africa in the last 2 years. And while the correlation was not exact, the interesting thing was places where a combination of lack of inflation or subsidy had kept bread prices for the masses were quite stable, and other places where food prices had unofficially crept out into the extremes were quite unstable. I mean, they didn't claim anything more than that, but
because I mean, there are other factors which are clearly also important. You have to have a regime which isn't going to fight to the last bullet if you're going to have a successful uprising of this kind, and you have to have demography is also presumably a part of this, because the Arab world has a lot of young unemployed people.
I mean, the young are the detonators in all the situations we're talking about. They are the detonators in the Arab world, and they're the majority of the population. Here in the West, they've got a problem that their economic problem is they're the minority, and they're going to be supporting a big demographic tail of older people in a world where the current model can't offer them anything better.
Mary King, you'd say that there are other key factors, however, wouldn't you?
There are indeed other key factors. One of them is the civic capacity, that is the capacity for resistance on a sustained basis. Anybody can call a demonstration. It's very easy. Go out in front of the BBC and have a demonstration. But if you're talking about sustained, protracted, long-term mass action, particularly on a national basis, you've got to have a proliferation of groups inside the society, groups that choose their own leaders, that make their own decisions, that are used to deciding for themselves, that if their leadership gets locked up, they can prepare second or third tier to be ready to step out. This also helps in dealing with reprisals, which often come crushingly fast, and you will not survive the first round of arrests and retaliations without that.
You need churches or mosques or trade unions or voluntary groups.
Formal. And then in Tunisia, you had musical rock groups, you had women's groups, you had a lot of organizations that had been repressed by Ben Ali, moribund, pushed below ground, operating underground. The student movement was underground. But you had labor unions that knew how to call strikes. And once they got to general strikes involving the largest cities, then the entire society was involved.
Because I'd like to pick up on this directly with Paul, because one of the things that you describe in your book is the sort of tension and the difficulty, particularly in European demonstrations, between the old trade union movement, the old left with their banners marching along in their ideologies, and the people that you were talking to, who are the younger people, the students, organised differently. And there's quite a gap there, isn't there, at the moment?
There is a gap, and I think, although you could see it again in Egypt, actually, the way that trade union people stand in, say, the Alexandria or the Port Said, sort of authority, they're all standing together, quite physically close. They have this way of acting and way of struggling, organised workers, and then you've got the youth who
running around a bit more.
They run around a bit more, and look, I think each country is different, but above all, if you look at Greece, then you look at what is the movement. For 2 or 3 months, people occupied the main square of Greece quite peacefully. There were riots around it, but Syntagma Square was occupied. What kind of people were occupying it? It was primarily young, dislocated people. The people who had rioted in 2008, the students, migrants, and what we call precarious workers.
What's a precarious worker?
A precarious worker is somebody who maybe works for a coffee chain. Maybe they've got a degree, and what their job is to draw a heart on the cappuccino's froth. And in other words, they're earning the same when they've come out of college with their masters than they would be if they had no money, no qualification at all. That's what a precarious worker is. And that young mums. That's who was in Syntagma. Now, the thing is that the dynamics of revolutions or struggles are always actually, if you look at history, or look at the numerous uprisings in Paris in the 19th century, a dynamic between the sort of organised, solid, conservative workforce and the slightly mercurial, slightly crazy, urban, poor and student mass. I mean, this is nothing new. The interesting thing compared to the 20th century is the relative weakness so far of the workers and the relative sort of strength of the unorganised mass.
Which you might say is not that surprising given what's happened to the industrial economy of Western Europe during the period. I want to come back later on to the sort of ideology and the thinking behind all of this. But I'd like to bring Mary King, I'd like to bring you in to look in a little more detail at how these mass movements have come together and how they come together traditionally. Because one thing we haven't talked about directly is the importance of translating the experience of one group to that of another. We now have a world where techniques for embarrassing, humiliating, stopping in their tracks regimes around the world. I mean, there are handbooks and there are lessons in it, and this is passed around. Talk about the example of the Serbians, which is a good one.
I think what's really important is to understand that these movements don't just suddenly appear. They don't come from nowhere. They don't just happen. They occur because there's a readiness in the society and an understanding that there's something that they can do to get themselves out of a kind of hole that they might have been in for generations. So the flow of knowledge is extremely important, and it's getting easier all the time. Now, there's a group that Wael mentions in his book several times, the April 6 movement, which was named for Mahala strikes where the police were particularly brutal. And the April 6 movement sent Mohammed Adel to Belgrade in 2009 to meet with the student movement that had brought down Slobodan Milosevic. And he worked with them. How do you organize? Why is it so important that violence not be used? He brought back lots of teaching materials, films, and so on. He came back talking about discipline, planning, preparation. And of course, while he was there, he encountered a booklet called From Dictatorship to Democracy, which had been written by a Harvard scholar named Gene Sharp in response to a request from the Burmese pro-democracy movement in the late 1980s. It appeared in Burmese before it came out in English. It had been translated into Serbian, and the Serbian movement Otpor, which means resistance, had been studying it intensively in order to prepare for their movement that brought Milosevic down.
And just to spool even further back in time, there's a lot from the American civil rights movement in the 60s, which in turn learns in crucial ways from Gandhi and the resistance to the British in India.
A lot of people think that this was metaphorical, the connection between India and the United States. It absolutely was literal. There were black leaders traveling throughout the 1930s and 1940s to India in search of knowledge. They had a caste system, and they thought that what was happening in India could help them with their caste system. And they traveled in order to learn and understand. There begins to be, with the Montgomery bus boycott, things change because professional tutors get involved, Bayard Rustin and Jim Lawson, too, in particular, who had spent a great deal of time in India. So it becomes easier for them to teach the basic theories and methods of the use of nonviolent struggle because it's a body of knowledge. This is not just happenstance. And Gene Sharp has spent virtually all of his life working on this material, but today, it's possible to get case studies from almost anywhere in the world from a nonviolent struggle. It was not at that time. It's much easier today.
And that is slightly like what Paul was saying about students moving from Tahrir Square to London and back again. There is the movement, and people are passing on different techniques at the moment.
Global interchange is extremely important. One of the things the Serbian students did was to create a network of activists from around the world, experienced vets from South Africa, the Philippines, Lebanon, Georgia, Ukraine. And so the Egyptians working in April 6 were the beneficiaries of that kind of global interchange.
Yes. But how does this relate, Wael, to the question of nationalism or national pride? I mean, Egypt is a pretty nationalistic society. Egyptians don't like the notion that there are other people interfering in any way with their affairs. So how do you feel Egyptians fit into this? I mean, we talk about the Arab Spring. Egypt is by far the most important country that has overthrown a dictator there so far. But I mean, do you feel part of a wider movement that goes well beyond Egypt?
So definitely, everyone have learned lessons from I personally learned a lot from Gandhi, for example. I read about him and his biography. I used quotes of what Gandhi said all the time on the page, telling people that non-violence is the way. We're not gonna go the way the regime wants, because every dictator wants his opponents to be the extremists. He doesn't want mainstream people to be opposing him.
As we're seeing in Syria at the moment, the attempt to make it as bloody as possible so that the regime can claim these people are terrorists and Islamists.
I think the thinking that the Serbian revolution have influenced how the Egyptian one worked, I think I don't necessarily agree with that. I think that what really influenced the Egyptian revolution was the Tunisian revolution. The whole thing that happened is like when we looked at what happened in Tunisia, hey, you can actually take to the streets and spend, days and nights and insist on bringing down the dictator, and it happens. We have to do the same thing.
Yes, but I just want to, because there's a very strange thing that I still don't understand. This one kid who set himself on fire and started things going originally, I hadn't realised that there's been a whole wave of people setting themselves on fire before he did, and still now, afterwards.
I think
why him?
I think this is really terribly important. It's why you cannot explain the emergence of a mass movement by suffering or material causes, because there had been self-immolations in Tunisia in March and in November prior to Mohamed Bouazizi's immolation in December, and they had drawn no notice. And Le Monde Diplomatique found a study in a Tunis hospital from 1998 in which 15% of their admissions in the emergency room were of young men who had set themselves on fire. So you can't explain it by a single incident. There was a readiness in that society that was occurring, and there was strength in organizations, so even though they were suppressed.
It might be Paul's food prices, the age of the regime, various things come together, and there is just a moment which the world of social... Yeah, Paul.
I was going to say, though, I think there is an economic underpinning that goes beyond food prices. And it is, that moment when Lehman Brothers collapses in 2008 is, to me, the end of an era. It's the end of an era where the confident neoliberal elite rule the world. And remember what Karl Rove said. He said, we create history, we create reality, and you, the rest of the world, he called the reality-based community, you just study it. Meanwhile, we can create it in any shape we want to do so ourselves again. They thought they simply ruled the world. Lehman Brothers removed that certainty, and then as it trickles through to various countries, so you get Greece, you get Spain, obvious economic problems, the commodity price inflation in the developing world. America, the whole American discontent, I think is driven primarily by the breakdown of a model, and that's what catalyses it.
And let's just bring it back to Europe for a moment, because one of the issues, I'd like to talk about the politics of this now, is that the centre-left, if you like, call it that way, across Europe, had an idea that if you have a European Union, you bring it all together, and you can bring in all sorts of rights, employment rights and so on, that is the way to a better future. And we're now in a situation where a country like Greece, or indeed Ireland, is having sort of bureaucrats imposed on them, tax and spending policies imposed on them, and in effect, no proper democracy. And that is where that sort of allegedly progressive centre-left policy has arrived.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's something deeper for when we talk about the centre-left. I mean, it's everything from liberalism to the far left. I mean, this is the problem. For 20 years, they had decided that nothing could change. And the whole strategy of the left was kind of based on the fact that, as one philosopher put it, it's impossible to it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. So we accommodate to it, and the European Union is just one example. What I've described in the book is the process of disorientation, in fact. I mean, it's no surprise to me that left parties are falling apart and there's a crisis on the left because of the uprisings that are going on, because they're largely hierarchical, whether we're talking about liberalism, social democracy, Marxism. They're hierarchical entities. They've kind of based themselves, as New Labour did, on this project, a progressive form of neoliberalism, neoliberal capitalism.
Which just to deconstruct it, basically means letting the system run as it wants to, and swiping enough taxes to put into a welfare system so that the people put out of work have enough to live on.
That's true. But in the developing world, it means something else. It means that you go and you become the cheerleader for Gamal Mubarak, Saif Gaddafi. Remember... No
idea who you're talking about.
Gamal Mubarak. Oh, you mean the cheerleaders?
Yeah.
Well, it was New Labour.
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to the future for Egypt, you have all these different groups. You have groups on the left, you have the Muslim Brotherhood and so on. Is there a sort of political or ideological conversation taking place about the new Egypt that people want to see emerging from this? Well,
There are many discussions at the moment, and I think it's very healthy because we haven't done that for years. Everyone was in the past scared to speak up, and most of these groups were working underground, or without directly communicating their ideas with the people. Most of the Egyptians are in the mainstream. They don't really belong to this school of thought or another one. And what is happening now, there is sort of an evolution. Everyone is trying to sell their ideologies and to tell people how that fits for the new Egypt. While many people are frustrated from the length and the style of these debates and arguments that are going place, I think it's pretty healthy because for the first time we are all in the field now and we have to deal with the real problems. And the real problems at the moment can be easily seen as that 1 out of every 2 Egyptians live under $2 a day. 1 out of every 3 Egyptians can't read and write. These are the real challenges that have to do with economy and education, and definitely with the rest of the basic needs.
So in a sense, the wider, bigger political conundrums can wait for a while you start to solve the basic bread and butter ones.
And this is why I'm very optimistic. People are not going to accept someone lecturing them. People want the solutions. And the fact, as of today, going back to the answer, why Bouazizi, why Khaled Said, why? I think it has to do a lot with how the government reacted. In Bouazizi case, when the protests happened in his city, the regime reacted violently. So more and more people started to join. In Egypt... And
then Ben Ali closed all of the educational institutions on January 10th, and that did it.
Yes,
that was the beginning
definitely.
of the general strikes.
In Egypt, if Mubarak came on 25th of January and he said, hey, listen, I've seen your 4 demands, I'm going to do the 4 of them, it would have been over. And no one have been able to protest. But once the regime decides on... dealing...
So you need a just right regime, a regime that fails to answer enough of the protests so the thing carries on, but doesn't go to full-scale bloody confrontation, isn't prepared just to keep gunning down its citizens.
And not only that, I think also censorship. With the new technology, more and more people are empowered to speak up and convince others of their ideologies and their offerings. So it's very critical at the moment, once media is decentralized, that you have to face the problems rather than escape from them or censor or...
And Mary King, you do need a regime, if you're going to have a successful uprising, you do need a regime mostly which is not prepared to go all the way. I mean, I've just come back from the Ukraine and Russia, and where they said a Ukrainian revolution, now mired in corruption and very disappointing long-term effects. But during that protest, not a single drop of blood was spilled. And when you go to Moscow and they're talking about that kind of thing happening here, absolute bloodbath. They say if it happens, it'll be ghastly. It'll be huge numbers of people will be killed here. And it does depend on the nature and the self-confidence of the regime, or the desperation of the regime.
Let me answer it this way. There are about 200 scholars working intensively on nonviolent struggle throughout the world in so many societies. And their work really suggests it's the extent of preparedness of the people is more important than the type of regime.
Really?
That's where it comes down. Let me also share with you another thing that I think might be going on in the background of the Arab awakening. These nonviolent struggles for regime change are incredibly more successful than violent insurrections. And there's a new book by Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan that's documented this based on studying more than 300 violent and nonviolent struggles from 1900 to 2006. So you actually have a degree of effectiveness and efficacy. And I think with the Arab awakening, we should not assume that this thing is over by any means. I think it's just the beginning. One of the most remarkable things is that this was a region of the world that was drenched with the ideologies of armed struggle, saturated. The Soviet Union, Syria's work, pushing the Palestinians toward armed struggle. There was probably no other part of the world with such concentration.
So I'm going to put you all on the spot right at the end of this. We've got Syria going on at the moment. How do we think that's going to end? And then I suppose the next biggest ones are we going to see these kind of movements spread to places like Saudi Arabia and Iran? Silence!
Well, I think that in Syria, we can already almost see the beginning of the end because there are so many efforts underway to negotiate options. They're not all public, but
Side
some of them.
conversations are going on, okay.
There's a lot going on.
What about places like Iran and Saudi Arabia?
Iran and Saudi Arabia are very active below the radar. There's a great deal going on. Countries like Zimbabwe, there's tremendous, all over the world there are nonviolent movements at work, some of which we cannot even see now.
Paul Mason?
I think the revolution that's going on is far more about culture and behaviour among people, and therefore it's in countries that we wouldn't necessarily expect to see an overthrow of the government. We will see a changing balance of power between people and governments, and the one that is right in my there are two right in my crosshairs. One is China, which is overdue and happening, I think, online Chinese activism, and the other, you don't have to go close to the poor of America much to see what a tinderbox the American poor have become and how big the American poverty-stricken masses are.
Fascinating. Final thought from Wael.
I would plus one in a geeky style with Paul and Mary in what they said. I also believe that if the revolution or what's taking place in the Arab world at the moment have taught us something, it just tells us that dictatorship cannot really sustain with a new world, with the new information and technology and the progress of communications. Governments have to learn their lesson, and it's going to be harder and harder in the next few years that governments start to. You cannot just do what you want and ignore the people will. So I just think that it's very important and critical for governments to understand the lesson.
All right. Tahrir Square, symbolically around the world, 1 year on. Thank you to all my guests. Mary King, Professor of Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Oxford. Wael Ghonim, whose Revolution 2.0, and Paul Mason, whose Why It's Kicking Off Everywhere, The New Global Revolutions, are both out now. Thanks to you. Next week, neocons versus the traditionalists and the Tea Party and caring capitalism as we talk about the soul of modern conservatism with Peter Hitchens, Margot Janes, Douglas Murray and Thomas Frank. But for now, thank you and goodbye. Thank you for listening to this Radio 4 podcast. If you've enjoyed it, you might like to try others like it, such as In Our Time or Thinking Aloud, both of which are also available from the Radio 4 website. Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello. As European leaders gather today for yet another slithering crisis grappling summit, all too aware of the anger on the streets of Athens, and as we hear of more bloody confrontation in Syria, we're looking at the subject of uprising or revolution. Paul Mason, economics editor of BBC's Newsnight, argues in Why It's Kicking Off Everywhere that apparently disparate protest movements from the Arab world to Europe are connected by the failure of the latest version of capitalism and by the techniques protesters use. Mary King, a peace studies professor at Oxford, is sceptical about too much emphasis being placed on the internet. She's been studying the peaceful overthrow of regimes around the world. And exactly a year after those extraordinary scenes in Cairo's Tahrir Square, we start with one of the bloggers who helped to orchestrate that uprising, who was arrested and held blindfolded for 11 days, but who is with us this morning. Wael Ghonim, welcome. Let's start by describing your position at the beginning of the unrest. You were unusual in the sense that you were actually not in Egypt itself, and you were working for Google.
Yes. Actually, at the beginning, I'd like to thank you for hosting me, and I want to say that I don't want to take much credit of orchestrating the uprising. I think that this is something. The revolution was leaderless, and it was ignited by many people who have worked together, and it has to be fair. To be fair,
you have to be fair to others,
everyone.
But
themselves in the virtual world because they were scared in the actual world. But not only that, the fact that you can communicate, you can do a lot of many-to-many communications online, makes you more interested in going through your goals. So, for example, when I created the page, in the first day there was 36,000 people on the page. A lot of them wrote comments and participated and said something about it. If you come and join that crowd of 36,000 people, you'll be more encouraged to participate than if you find out that only 5 people discussing something.
So numbers count. One of the other things that you explain in the book is the way that you describe yourself on the page. You say I. You talk about in your own name, and you use and your book about this is you're very careful not to take too much credit. Nonetheless, your website was one of the places where people gathered and which disseminated information about the protests as they started. Yep. Tell us a little bit about what the website did, how you started it, the original photograph that began it all.
It started on the 8th of June. I saw a photo on Facebook on my wall of a young Egyptian who looked horribly tortured. The picture was just horrible. I looked at it and it turned out that his name is Khalid Saeed. He died after 2 security police officers were chasing him, and according to witnesses, he was beaten up to death. At that time, I started, few months before, I started to become politically active. I was not happy with how my country was going, and I thought that it was important to do something. I leveraged my knowledge, so I created a page, and that page was on Facebook that say, "We are all Khalid Saeed." I wanted to defend his right, and I wanted to make sure that justice will prevail in his case and many other cases. And what was very interesting at that stage was that because he came from a middle class, he was an internet user, a lot of people connected with him, and that was very critical in the whole story.
So this allowed, as it were, a conversation to take place, which could not have taken place physically on the streets or in cafes at that time.
Absolutely, and this is what I explain in the book. A lot of people started to express